Raj had always dreamed of living in a place where the air was fresh, the nights were quiet, and the view stretched far beyond what the eye could hold. For many years, he worked day and night, saving every coin he could, building a life brick by brick. While others spent on short pleasures, Raj saved. While others doubted, Raj planned. At last, after years of patient effort, his dream began to rise high on a mountain slope. The mansion Raj built was not just a house. It was a reflection of his journey. Its tall glass windows faced the sunrise so that every morning the first light touched his living room. Wide balconies curved like arms around the structure, giving him a view of the valley below where tiny houses and winding roads seemed like part of a painting. Inside, the mansion was simple but strong. Raj cared more about space than decoration. He filled the rooms with sturdy wooden furniture and shelves of books he had collected since youth. The sound of the wind outside and the soft creak of wood inside made the place feel alive. At first, when Raj moved in, the neighbors seemed polite. They waved from their cars, smiled when walking by, and sometimes stopped for small conversations. It felt welcoming. Raj thought he had finally found peace. But peace often comes with shadows, and the first shadow arrived in the form of an envelope. One morning, Raj found a letter slipped under his gate. It was from the Homeowners Association, or HOA as the letterhead declared. The letter was short and stern. It demanded a fee for community services and maintenance. Raj read it twice, confused. His land was private, his mansion stood on his own purchased soil, and he had never signed any paper binding him to an association. He placed the letter aside, believing it was a mistake. A week later, another letter came. This one was more forceful. It spoke of late payment, of penalties, and of actions that may be taken if the fees were not delivered. Raj frowned. He had never used any of the services the letter mentioned. No one had planted trees for him, no one had repaired his driveway, no one had touched the mountain slope where his house stood. Everything he had built alone. Raj decided to visit the HOA office, a small brick building near the valley entrance. Inside, he found a few people sitting behind desks, stacks of files piled high. At the center sat Paul, the president of the association. Paul was a tall man with sharp glasses and a voice that carried more pride than warmth. Raj politely explained that he had never agreed to be part of the HOA and that his land records clearly showed independence. Paul only smiled and tapped the table. He spoke about community rules, about shared responsibility, about unity. But beneath his words Raj sensed a push, a demand that had little to do with unity and much to do with control. Raj left that office without signing anything. Days turned into weeks, and the letters did not stop. They grew harsher, printed in red ink with larger words like final notice and legal action. Raj kept them all in a folder, carefully dated, knowing that truth was his shield. Yet deep inside, he felt a storm was coming. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Raj sat on his balcony. He sipped tea and listened to the birds returning to their nests. He thought of the years he had spent working to make this life possible. He remembered the nights of study when he was younger, the long shifts at work, the sacrifices of simple joys so he could save for something greater. This house was not just wood and stone. It was memory, sacrifice, and dignity. The thought of losing it over unjust demands made his chest tighten. The next morning, Raj saw two men near his gate. They were measuring the land with long tapes and writing in clipboards. When Raj asked what they were doing, they replied that they were acting on behalf of the HOA, checking boundaries for future adjustments. Raj firmly told them to leave, and though they walked away, he could see the smirk on their faces. It was the smirk of people who believed they held power. At night, Raj opened his old files. Long ago, before he built his mansion, he had been an urban planner. He knew how districts were drawn, how rules were shaped, how papers could either protect or destroy. He traced his finger along the lines of old maps, reminding himself that knowledge was stronger than threats. He whispered to himself that he would not be forced, that he would stand firm. But even as he reassured himself, Raj knew the HOA would not give up easily. Power never steps back without a struggle. One morning, just as the mountain mist lifted, Raj heard engines in the distance. The sound was not of cars, but of heavy machines. He stepped outside and saw trucks slowly moving up the slope. His heart tightened. Behind the trucks were bulldozers, their metal arms raised like creatures of destruction. On the front truck, Paul stood again, waving papers in the air. Raj walked down his driveway, calm but firm. He called out to Paul, asking what was happening. Paul shouted back that unpaid fees had reached the point of action, and the HOA had full rights to seize property and demolish structures. Raj held up his hand and declared that no such rights existed over his land, that the HOA had no legal claim. But his voice, though steady, was drowned by the roar of engines. The machines stopped near the gate. Workers stepped out, some hesitant, some indifferent. Paul barked orders, pointing toward the mansion. Raj stood tall, blocking the path, but Paul only lifted the papers higher and spoke louder. The sun was rising behind them, casting long shadows across the driveway. The valley below was silent, as if holding its breath. Raj realized this was not a mistake anymore. It was a battle of will. His mansion, his dream, his years of sacrifice stood behind him. In front of him were forces that believed they could bend anyone with fear and force. As he looked at the bulldozers lined up, Raj felt both anger and clarity. He knew that whatever happened next would shape not only his future, but the very balance of power in the valley. The mansion on the mountain was more than a home now. It was a symbol. And Raj, standing there with the wind in his hair and the morning light on his face, made a silent promise. He would not let them win. Raj woke early the next morning. The sky was still pale and the valley below was covered in mist. Normally, he loved this hour. It was quiet, only the sound of birds calling through the trees. But today his heart was heavy. The memory of the bulldozers lining up near his mansion the day before had not left his mind. He had stopped them from entering, at least for that day, but he knew they would return. He made tea in his small kitchen, sat near the window, and thought carefully. Raj had always believed in reason. He believed that people could talk, explain, and reach understanding. But the way the HOA acted was not about reason. It was about pressure. It was about making him bend. While he thought, he heard a sharp sound at the gate. It was not the soft knock of a visitor. It was a heavy bang, repeated again and again. Raj stood up and walked down the stone path toward the gate. When he opened it, he found a group of people standing outside. At the front was Paul, the HOA president. He held a folder in his hand and wore a confident smile that did not match the coldness in his eyes. Behind him stood 3 other board members and 2 men who looked like hired workers. They carried tools and stood tall, waiting for instructions. Paul spoke loudly, as if trying to show authority. He told Raj that the HOA had given him many notices. He said the time for patience had ended. According to him, the board had voted, and action had to be taken. Raj did not answer immediately. He looked at the group, at their stiff postures, at the way the workers shifted nervously. Then he looked back at Paul. Calmly, Raj explained again that he was not a member of the HOA, that his land was private, that his mansion stood on soil he had purchased freely. He said he had never signed their agreements, and he owed them nothing. Paul's smile faded for a moment, then returned quickly. He pulled papers from his folder and waved them in the air. He claimed these were legal approvals, documents that gave the HOA the right to act. Raj asked to see them closely, but Paul did not hand them over. He only flashed the papers, then tucked them back into the folder. The board members behind Paul nodded as if to support his words, but Raj noticed their eyes. Some looked unsure. Some avoided his gaze. They were not as confident as Paul wanted them to be. Raj stood tall and said that if the HOA touched a single stone of his house without lawful orders from the state, they would be breaking the law themselves. His voice was calm, but it carried strength. Even the workers shifted uncomfortably. Paul leaned closer to the gate, his smile now thin and tight. He told Raj that resistance would only bring greater cost, greater trouble, greater loss. He said that one way or another, the HOA always collected what it demanded. Then he turned and waved for his group to leave. Before walking away, he looked back once more, as if trying to warn Raj silently. When they were gone, Raj closed the gate and walked slowly back toward the mansion. His heart was beating fast, but his steps were steady. He knew now that the battle had entered a new stage. They had not yet dared to send the bulldozers inside, but the threat was clear. That night, Raj could not sleep. He sat in his study surrounded by shelves of books and old files. He pulled out the folder where he had kept all the HOA letters. He arranged them in order, each one more demanding than the last. Then he opened a drawer and took out his land documents. He read them line by line, checking every signature, every stamp. Raj had been an urban planner once. He had studied maps, boundaries, zoning laws, and property rights. He knew the weight of documents. He knew how rules were made and how they could be undone. Looking at his papers, he found strength. He whispered to himself that truth was stronger than threats, and patience was stronger than noise. The next day, Raj visited a small office in town. It was the office of a lawyer he had trusted in the past, a quiet man named Mehul who rarely spoke but always listened carefully. Raj placed the folder of HOA letters on the desk and explained everything. Mehul read each letter with care, then looked at Raj with calm eyes. He said the HOA could not act as they claimed without proper state approval. He said their threats were empty if Raj's land was fully independent. Raj felt a wave of relief, but it was small. He knew the HOA would not stop because of words alone. They would push further, hoping fear would break him. And he was right. 3 days later, loud engines returned. This time, the machines came all the way to the gate. Raj stood outside, waiting. The sun was bright, and neighbors from the valley gathered at a distance to watch. They whispered among themselves, unsure what would happen. Paul arrived again, walking ahead of the bulldozers. His folder was in his hand, his glasses shining in the light. He shouted that this was the final action, that Raj's property would be cleared, that resistance was useless. Raj raised his hand and spoke firmly. He told the workers that no lawful order existed for them to touch his house. He told them that if they did, they would be responsible for damage on private land. His voice echoed across the slope, reaching even the neighbors below. The workers looked at one another. Some hesitated. The bulldozer engines idled, but none moved forward. Paul grew red with anger, shouting louder, waving his folder wildly. But still, the machines did not move. Raj knew this was not victory, only a pause. The Hoa would gather strength again. But for now, his words had held the line. As the sun sank behind the hills, the machines retreated. The neighbors returned to their homes. Raj stood alone near his gate, his shadow stretching long across the driveway. He knew the struggle was far from over. Yet he also knew something else. Each time he stood firm, the Hoa showed more cracks. Each time he refused fear, their control weakened. The knock at the gate had been loud and threatening. But Raj had answered it with calm strength. And deep in his heart, he promised that the next time they returned, he would be ready not only to defend but also to strike back with truth and knowledge. The days after the standoff at the gate were not easy for Raj. On the surface, life seemed normal. He still woke early, made tea, and sat on his balcony watching the sun rise. He still walked along the stone path, checked the garden, and read books in his study. Yet, inside, his heart carried the weight of worry. He knew the Hoa would not forget. They had stepped back once, but they would surely return. Every evening, Raj saw neighbors passing by on the valley road. Some stopped and spoke quietly with him. They admired his courage for standing up to the bulldozers. They admitted they too were tired of paying endless fees to the Hoa. Some said they had seen money collected for repairs but never saw any repairs made. Others whispered that Paul and his close board members used the funds for themselves. Raj listened carefully but gave no quick replies. He did not want to speak too much until he was fully prepared. One evening, after hearing yet another story of unfair fees, Raj walked back into his study and locked the door. He pulled down heavy files from the shelves. These were not ordinary books. They were maps, zoning papers, and planning records from years ago when he had worked as an urban planner. His hands moved over the pages like someone touching old friends. Raj studied the maps of the valley. He traced the lines of districts and boundaries. He looked at how the Hoa had been registered years ago, when only a few houses stood in the area. Slowly, he realized something important. The Hoa had overstepped its limits. Their district was drawn for a smaller zone, not the wide valley they now claimed. By stretching their control beyond what was written in the law, they had broken their own foundation. As this truth sank in, Raj felt a fire light up inside him. The Hoa believed they had power, but in reality their power was fragile. They were building on sand, not stone. All it would take was the right move, and the structure they had built for years would collapse. Raj spent night after night in his study. He wrote notes, copied references, and marked every weak point in the Hoa's papers. He compared his own land documents with the district maps and found proof that his mansion stood outside their legal zone. He checked state records and found that the Hoa had not updated their registration for years. That meant many of their actions were invalid. During the day, Raj stayed calm, acting as if nothing was happening. He spoke politely with neighbors, worked in his garden, and even repaired parts of the house damaged by weather. But once night arrived, he returned to his study and worked late under a single lamp. His desk filled with papers, his hands filled with ink, but his eyes shone with determination. One afternoon, Mehul, the lawyer Raj trusted, came to visit. Raj showed him the research he had gathered. Mehul read through the papers slowly, nodding again and again. Finally, he looked up and said Raj had enough evidence to file a strong case against the Hoa. He explained that not only could Raj protect his mansion, but he could also challenge the very existence of the Hoa district. Raj listened carefully. The idea of bringing down the entire Hoa sounded heavy, almost unbelievable. But then he thought of the families who had complained to him. He thought of the money taken unfairly, the fear spread by letters, the threats shouted at his gate. Slowly, Raj nodded. He said he was ready. Together, Raj and Mehul began preparing official documents. They collected signatures from neighbors willing to support the case. They made copies of every HOA letter, every receipt, every notice. Raj attached maps and highlighted the boundaries that proved the HOA's reach was unlawful. While Raj prepared quietly, the HOA acted loudly. Paul called another meeting in the community hall. He stood on stage, waving papers again, declaring that Raj was a troublemaker who refused to follow community rules. He warned the people that if Raj's mansion remained, it would bring harm to the valley. Some nodded in fear, but many stayed silent. They remembered how Raj had faced bulldozers without backing down. They began to see that Paul's loud voice was not strength but desperation. One night, Raj was working in his study when he heard a knock on his door. It was not heavy like the HOA's knocks. It was soft, almost hesitant. When he opened the door, he found a young couple from the valley standing there. They said they had been fined by the HOA for no reason and were thinking of moving away. They had heard Raj was fighting back and wanted to help. Raj invited them inside, gave them tea, and listened to their story. Before leaving, they handed him a small folder of their own papers, proof of unfair treatment. Raj thanked them warmly and promised their voices would be heard. More neighbors began visiting quietly. Some left notes, some left old receipts, some whispered warnings of what Paul was planning next. Raj collected everything, storing it carefully in his study. The mansion became more than a home. It became a place of hope, a quiet fortress where truth was being gathered. Despite his growing strength, Raj never forgot caution. He knew Paul would not sit idle. Indeed, one afternoon, Raj saw strange men near his land again. They were not measuring this time, but they stood near the edge of his property, watching in silence. Raj walked toward them calmly, and they walked away quickly. He realized Paul was trying to keep him under pressure, trying to make him afraid. But Raj was no longer the same man who had first received those letters. Now he carried knowledge, and knowledge was power. As days passed, the papers in Raj's study grew thicker, the evidence stronger, and his plan clearer. He was not only defending himself anymore. He was preparing to challenge the entire system that had bullied the valley for years. The mansion, once just a dream house on a mountain, was now a command post of quiet resistance. Every stone of it stood for his struggle, every window looked out over the valley with purpose. Raj walked its halls with a new sense of destiny. He knew the battle ahead would not be simple. The HOA would fight back with every trick they had. But he also knew something they did not. They thought he was just one man standing alone. In truth, he was one man standing with the law, with knowledge, and slowly with the support of many neighbors. The hidden strength that Raj carried in his files, in his study, and in his steady heart was about to be revealed. And when it was, the valley would never be the same again. The valley had grown restless. For years, the HOA had acted like rulers, demanding money and making threats, but now people had begun to whisper new words. They spoke of Raj, the man on the mountain who had stood firm when bulldozers came. They spoke of how he was gathering papers and proof. Quietly, the people who once feared the HOA started to hope that change might be possible. Raj did not see himself as a hero. He was simply protecting what was his. Yet, as he worked night after night with his lawyer Mehul, he realized his case was no longer only about his mansion. It was about the entire valley. The HOA had stretched their power far beyond what was written in law, and if someone did not stop them, they would keep growing stronger. One morning, Raj carried a stack of documents into the district office. His steps were steady, his back straight. He handed the papers to a clerk and explained the situation. The clerk raised his eyebrows as he saw the thickness of the file. It was not a pile of angry complaints but carefully ordered evidence. Maps, zoning rules, land deeds, financial irregularities, and signed testimonies from neighbors, all of it bound together with precision. Mehul joined him at the office. Together they filed a formal petition to review the HOA's district rights and activities. The petition was not about small disputes. It was about the very foundation of the HOA. If approved, the state would have to examine whether the HOA had any legal authority left. When word of this petition reached Paul, the president of the HOA, he was furious. He called another meeting in the community hall and filled the room with speeches about loyalty and rules. He told the residents that Raj was a selfish man who wanted to destroy unity. He shouted that without the HOA, the valley would fall into chaos. But his words were not received the same way they once had been. People sat quietly, some looking down, some exchanging glances. They remembered the bulldozers, the threats, the endless fees. Slowly, doubt was replacing fear. Paul tried harder. He sent new letters to the residents, demanding higher fees to fight legal costs. He even hired people to spread rumors that Raj was planning to sell his mansion to outsiders who would not respect the valley. But the more Paul pushed, the less the people believed him. They had begun to see the cracks in his power. Meanwhile, Raj stayed calm. He did not answer Paul's rumors with anger. He answered with facts. He released copies of maps and legal lines that showed the HOA had no control over large parts of the valley. He showed receipts from neighbors proving they had paid for repairs that were never done. He revealed old documents showing that the HOA had failed to renew its registration properly. Each fact was like a stone, and together they built a wall of truth that the HOA could not climb. Weeks passed, and the state office finally announced a formal hearing. It would decide whether the HOA's district would remain or be dissolved. The news spread quickly across the valley. Some felt nervous, others felt hopeful, but everyone knew it would be historic. On the day of the hearing, Raj walked into the hall with Mehul by his side. He carried no anger, only determination. The HOA board sat across the room, with Paul at the center, his face tight with frustration. Folders of papers were stacked on both sides, but it was clear one side carried strength and the other carried excuses. The hearing lasted for hours. Paul spoke loudly, waving his hands, claiming the HOA was the backbone of the valley. He said Raj was trying to destroy years of progress. But when the officials asked for clear proof of authority, Paul's words stumbled. He produced some papers, but they were outdated and incomplete. Then it was Raj's turn. He spoke slowly and clearly. He explained how the HOA's district lines were drawn years ago for a much smaller zone. He showed maps proving the HOA had expanded beyond its legal borders. He presented testimonies from residents who had been unfairly fined. He revealed how funds were collected but never used for promised services. Every document was organized, every fact precise. The officials listened carefully, nodding as they turned the pages. By the time Raj finished, the hall was silent. Even the neighbors who had come to watch sat wide-eyed, realizing just how deep the truth ran. The officials announced that they would review all evidence and deliver a written decision in the coming weeks. The HOA board left the hall quickly, their heads low. Raj walked out slowly, greeted by neighbors who shook his hand and thanked him. Some even said they had not felt such hope in years. When Raj returned to his mansion that evening, he stood on the balcony looking over the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky with deep orange light. He felt tired but also at peace. He had spoken the truth, and the truth was now in motion. But Paul was not done yet. Though shaken, he still tried to cling to control. He called secret meetings with his closest allies. He tried to pressure more residents into paying fees, warning them that the HOA still had power. He even sent men once more near Raj's land to frighten him. But each attempt felt weaker than the last. For the neighbors had changed. The hearing had shown them that the HOA's power was not unshakable. They began to resist openly. Some refused to pay fees. Some demanded refunds. Some wrote letters of complaint to the state, supporting Raj's petition. The valley was waking up, and Paul could not silence it. One night, as Raj sat in his study, he heard another knock at the door. This time it was not a couple, but a group of families. They carried folders of their own, with receipts, letters, and complaints. They asked Raj to include their documents in his case. Raj welcomed them inside, offered tea, and promised that their voices would also be part of the fight. Slowly, the mansion on the mountain became a beacon. It was no longer only Raj's home. It was a gathering place where the people of the valley brought their truth. And with each new piece of evidence, the case against the HOA grew stronger. Raj knew the final decision was still to come. He knew Paul would not give up until the very end. But the tide had turned. The man who once stood alone at his gate now stood with the valley behind him. The HOA had tried to frighten him with bulldozers, but instead they had awakened a force they never expected. The tables had turned, and soon the state would write the final word. The valley waited with quiet breath. News of the hearing had spread to every corner, and the people spoke of little else. Some gathered at the market each morning, discussing what the officials might decide. Some whispered in their homes, hoping the HOA would finally lose its grip. For years, the valley had lived under the weight of fees and threats. Now, for the first time, people felt that freedom was near. Raj remained calm. Each day he walked through his mansion, checked the garden, and spent hours in his study. He had already given all his evidence. There was nothing more he could do but wait. Yet, while he waited, he prepared. He continued to gather papers from neighbors, continued to make notes, and continued to speak with Mehul. He told himself that no matter what the decision was, he would not step back. The HOA, meanwhile, was restless. Paul no longer held the same power he once had. His speeches drew fewer people. His letters demanding fees were now ignored by many. Even his closest allies began to question him in private. Still, Paul refused to admit defeat. He believed he could still bend the valley with fear. But the more he tried, the more the people resisted. The tide had turned. One bright morning, a courier climbed the mountain slope and stopped at Raj's gate. In his hand was a thick envelope sealed with the mark of the state. Raj signed for it and carried it into his study. He placed it on the desk and sat silently for a moment. The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind through the open window. Then, with steady hands, he broke the seal and began to read. The decision was clear. The state had reviewed every map, every deed, every financial record. The conclusion was that the HOA had overstepped its legal boundaries. The district lines were invalid. The registration had lapsed years ago. The funds collected were not properly accounted for. The state declared the HOA dissolved. Its board had no more authority. Its accounts would be frozen, its actions undone. Raj read the words twice, making sure he had not imagined them. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. A deep breath escaped his chest, not of relief alone but of justice. The battle that had begun with letters and threats had now ended with truth and law. Later that day, Raj walked into the valley carrying a copy of the decision. People gathered around him as he read aloud. His voice was steady, but the crowd's reaction was loud. Some cheered, some clapped, some cried with joy. Families who had lived under fear for years felt a new lightness in their hearts. The HOA that had once ruled over them was no more. Paul, hearing the news, shut himself inside the HOA office. But soon officials arrived with state orders. They collected the files, sealed the doors, and locked the building. The board members who had once stood beside Paul quietly slipped away, unwilling to face the people. The office that had been a place of threats now stood silent, a reminder of power that had crumbled. For Raj, the victory was not about pride. It was about freedom. He walked back up the mountain that evening, looking at the valley below. The sun was setting, and the fields glowed in golden light. He thought of the years he had spent building his mansion, the threats he had faced, the nights he had worked under a lamp. It had all led to this moment. His mansion was still damaged from the day the bulldozers had tried to enter, but now he looked at it with fresh eyes. It was not only a home anymore. It was a symbol. It had stood firm when pressure tried to break it. Just like the mountain itself, it had not moved. In the weeks that followed, Raj began to rebuild. He repaired broken walls, replaced wooden beams, and cleaned the garden. Neighbors came to help. Some brought tools, some brought food, and some simply came with encouragement. Children ran around the wide balcony, laughing freely. The mansion became a place of gathering, no longer just for Raj but for the entire valley. The people decided they would no longer live under forced rules. Instead, they would work together in simple ways, helping each other when needed, without demands or hidden fees. A new sense of unity grew, not out of fear but out of choice. And many looked to Raj as a guide, though he never asked for the role. One evening, as the valley lights twinkled below, Raj stood on his balcony with Mehul. The lawyer smiled and said the fight had not only saved the mansion but had changed the valley forever. Raj nodded quietly. He knew the journey had not been easy, but he also knew it was worth every step. The mountain stood tall, and so did the people who lived around it. Raj often thought back to the day he had first found an envelope at his gate. What had begun as a demand for fees had grown into a struggle for truth. He remembered the roar of bulldozers, the heavy knock of threats, the long nights of study. He remembered the faces of neighbors who had once been silent but later stood beside him. He realized that strength was not only in one man but in a community that chooses courage over fear. Years later, when new families moved into the valley, they heard the story of the mountain mansion. They learned how one man had faced a powerful board, how truth had erased false authority, and how freedom had been restored. The story spread, becoming part of the valley's memory. And each time the tale was told, the mountain seemed to stand taller, as if guarding the memory of justice. Raj never called himself a hero. He was a simple man who wanted peace. But sometimes peace must be defended, and sometimes one person's stand can change the lives of many. His mansion was not only bricks and glass. It was proof that dignity cannot be bulldozed, that knowledge can outlast threats, and that a valley can find its voice again. As the sun rose each morning, Raj would sit with his tea and look over the valley. The mist would lift, the fields would glow, and the birds would sing. and in those moments, he would smile. For he knew that the mountain stood tall not just because of stone and soil, but because of the truth that had been protected there. The HOA was gone, the valley was free, and the mansion on the mountain remained.